The president's thought on the markets and your money has us scratching our heads this morning.
I don't know how you can impeach somebody who's done a great job. I'll tell you what, if I ever got impeached, I think the market would crash. I think everybody would be very poor, because without this thinking, you would see numbers that you wouldn't believe in reverse.
Okay, first of all, if you see numbers you wouldn't believe in reverse, then that would mean that you'd see numbers that you would believe. But let's leave that aside for a second. A looming impeachment and the surrounding uncertainty can have an effect on markets. There's no question about that. But for fact's sake, would the market crash if Trump were impeached? We don't have a lot of history on this because we don't have a lot of history on impeachments. But let's take a look at what we have. The impeachment of President Bill Clinton. In the fall of 1998, the market dropped. You can see that there. That's the ahead of the Starr report being released. It dropped almost 20% ahead of the report that was released by the investigator. But the report didn't contain anything groundbreaking, and the market drop settled shortly after the release. Now, when the impeachment proceedings began, get this, the S&P 500, which is what we look at, actually began to climb, gaining 28% by the time that the Senate impeached Bill Clinton, or acquitted Bill Clinton. They didn't impeach him. Market participants want certainty, and in the wake of an impeachment, there is the possibility of a sell-off, but an impeachment does by no means guarantee a crash. Joining me now is CNBC editor-at-large John Harwood. And John, the first thing we have to say when comparing things to past examples as it relates to markets and the economy is that the economy in 2018 is not the same as the economy was in 1998. There's actually a reason I didn't use the Richard Nixon example, because back in the early 1970s, the impact and the significance of the market are very different than they are now. The bottom line is there's no basis for President Trump to say the markets would crash if he were impeached.
If the president actually believes that, and he might, because his self-absorption is so complete that he seems to think that everything revolves around him. If he actually believes that, he's completely out of touch with reality. We're in, Ali, as you know, a 9-year bull market, most of which occurred under President Obama. If you take the totality of President Obama's 8 years in office, the Dow is up 149% during that time. The Dow is up about 29% during Trump's presidency so far. It is true that in 2017, there was a market boost that I think in part was inspired by the actions he was taking on deregulation, in part on the expectation of tax cuts. And so the market continued to go up late into the recovery pretty sharply last year. However, it's basically flat this year because the actions the president's taking on trade are damaging to economic prospects in the future. And so, no, the economy would not, the markets would not crash if the president left. There might be a blip associated with the uncertainty, but the markets ultimately are going to respond to economic fundamentals, corporate profitability, and that would not fundamentally change if Trump left.
The evidence of that is the last 2 years, where there have been all sorts of things that traditionally you and me would have said, wow, that's going to really affect the markets negatively, and they haven't, because as corporations continue to be profitable, markets continue to go up. Now, that could change. We're well into a period of growth. We're 10 years into a bull market almost. That independently could turn around.
Well, in fact, the fact that the Trump tax cuts front-loaded some economic activity, but have increased budget deficits. And the effects of that, the effects of the president's trade policies, have a lot of forecasters upgrading the possibility of a recession by 2020. That is because of or connected with actions that the president has taken. So, yes, the economy is going to turn down at some point. We haven't repealed the business cycle. There will be a recession. But it's not going to be triggered by Donald Trump leaving office. You could make an argument that markets would feel a lot more calm and have uncertainty reduced if Mike Pence were president for the next couple of years than Donald Trump.
All right, John, good to see you as always. Thanks very much, John Harwood. Joining me now is Austin Goolsbee, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama. Austin, I want to talk to you about some other stuff, but let's just stay on this for a second, because that's a good threat that the president is making to a lot of Americans. Say, well, look, the one thing you got going for you is these markets are going well. If I am impeached, it'll tank the markets. What's your take?
Look, I think you actually missed the dynamic there. I don't think the president was engaged in an observation. I don't think he was making an economic forecast. I think he was making a threat. I think he was saying, hey, the economy's looking pretty good. It'd be a shame if somebody were to burn it down, say somebody who had control over launching trade wars, changing regulations, applying tax rates to different groups. I think everybody should take a step back and ask yourself, do you honestly think that if they move to impeach Donald Trump, he's not going to try to burn it to the ground? I think he is. And I think that's what he said. And that's
Trump asked his lawyers for legal advice about pardoning Paul Manafort. Rudy Giuliani telling the Washington Post Trump's lawyers told him to hold off until the Mueller probe is over, and that Trump agreed. In a moment, I'm going to go to our panel on all of this stories breaking today, but we do want to begin with the reporter who broke that Manafort story, the Washington Post's Carol Leonnig. She joins us now live from Washington, D.C. Carol, good to have you with us this evening. Bring us up to speed on what exactly Rudy Giuliani told you.
So when we talked this afternoon, Rudy and I were talking about a lot of things. He was in Scotland. It was sort of later in the evening there. But I had a lot of questions for him about some of the issues that have been arising in the last few days and some of the president's tweets and Michael Cohen's guilty plea agreement. So anyway, what he said essentially was that the president had sought his and also Jay Sekulows' advice on whether or not to pardon Manafort and the timing of that. And he said later that this was really a conversation about everyone linked to the probe. And he said that his advice and Sekulows' advice to the president was, you can't do this now. You have to wait. The public opinion about you pardoning any of these individuals is going to be quite dubious, and you should hold off in making those decisions. Now, I want to give Rudy some credit as well. He called me back later after we posted the story and wanted to stress that he had remembered it imprecisely, and actually he feels like this conversation happened weeks earlier than he thought. First, he thought it was 3 to 5 weeks ago. He called back and said he thinks now maybe it was 2 months ago. A senior administration official believes that the president discussed this with his aides a few weeks ago.
Carol, do you get a sense, though, that the timing of that conversation occurred while the Manafort trial was underway?
Again, I'm going to credit Rudy Giuliani in his last corrected statement in which he says to me that he believes it was quite a bit longer before the trial. Now, Manafort was facing a lot of charges in a pretty damning case of tax evasion and bank fraud. It was fairly, high odds that he was going to be convicted based on those charges and the evidence that the government had. But again, I'm just going to let Giuliani say what he wants to say, which is that now he remembers it really probably was in June rather than in August. So
further along than recently. Did you get a sense at all, Carol, from your conversation with Rudy Giuliani as to why today did he mention this? I mean, he's obviously given a lot of interviews in the past. Was it your reading of his intent that maybe he was trying to send a signal to Paul Manafort?
I don't try to speculate or read people's intent. I take them at their word. I quote them verbatim. And what Giuliani was doing was what he does whenever we talk, which is he answered my question. I said, have you discussed a Manafort pardon with the president? And he said yes.
Fair enough. Okay, Carol Leonnig, appreciate it. Thank you very much. And now to the panel who may help us try to understand what all of this means and the day's fast-moving developments. While Trump is looking friendly toward Paul Manafort, he appears to feel differently toward this man.
Where are we going?
For a long walk. Thank you so much. Good luck.
All right, so Trump today trying to create distance from Michael Cohen.
Michael Cohen, tell me about your relationship with him.
Well, he was a lawyer for me for one of many. They always say the lawyer, and then they like to add the fixer. Well, I don't know if there's a fixer. He's been a lawyer for me, didn't do big deals, did small deals. Not somebody that was with me that much. They make it sound like I didn't live without him. He was somebody that was probably with me for about 10 years, and I would see him sometimes.
Almost sounds like he's trying to make it sound like he's the Trump Organization's coffee boy, but that's far from reality. Cohen worked for Trump for over a decade on deals like a Trump Tower in Moscow. His office was a few doors down from Trump's in a space previously used by his daughter Ivanka. And Trump's only pushing Cohen away after his guilty plea. Today we learned new details about that case. Prosecutors granted immunity to Trump friend and tabloid executive David Pecker, who told them about the payments Cohen made to silence women alleging affairs with Trump. But Cohen isn't the only lawyer Trump's going after today.
I put an attorney general that never took control of the Justice Department, Jeff Sessions, never took control of the Justice Department, and it's a sort of an incredible thing.
All right, so that outburst prompting a rare public response from Sessions, who says he, quote, took control of the Department of Justice the day he was sworn in, and that it won't be improperly influenced by political considerations. With me now, former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, who as a member of the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach then-President Richard Nixon. Jess McIntosh, a former aide to Hillary Clinton. Betsy Woodruff of the Daily Beast, and former federal prosecutor John Flannery. Great to have all of you with us. So lots to break down this hour. Congressman, if I may, I'll begin with you. Trump, on one hand, slamming his own attorney general, Jeff Sessions, the man he put in there, saying he did it because of his loyalty. He also went after Michael Cohen. But seems that at least floating the idea through various comments, either through Rudy Giuliani or ambiguous answers on Fox News, that he is considering a pardon for Paul Manafort. What do you make of this?
Well, I'm going to go back to Watergate, and I'm going to say that part of the articles of impeachment that was voted by the House Judiciary, Committee, had to do with offers of pardons to the burglars to keep them quiet. Let's just not forget that. That was part of it. The President of the United States authorized pardons for people, the burglars, to keep them quiet.
Are you seeing parallels, at least? Maybe not necessarily. What are the parallels? Is it the tone?
Of course.
Yeah, but I'm saying, like, maybe back then they were a little bit more explicit. Right now, we're not having a single person from the White House coming out and saying, yes, he will pardon Paul Manafort.
No, you don't need to say, yes, he will. That was very secret, the pardons.
Yeah.
The hush money was secret. The pardons were secret. That was part of the cover-up that got Richard Nixon reelected. What are the parallels? The President of the United States knows, Donald Trump knows, that Manafort may have some very, very damning information about him. It could even be criminal. It could even have to do with collusion. Remember, Manafort was in Ukraine dealing with the president of Ukraine. Putin was supporting that guy, and now Manafort becomes the campaign manager. Manafort may know a lot.
So definitely some parallels, yeah.
May know a lot. So wouldn't you want to keep Manafort's mouth shut? And this is not the first time, by the way, that we know that issues with regard to pardons have come out. I mean, Rudy doesn't just spill out stuff that's not relevant.
Right.
He's sending a message to Manafort, keep your mouth shut. Don't say anything.
Jess, I see that you're kind of wanting to get in on this part of the conversation.
I mean,
what's your take?
The Congresswoman is absolutely correct about this. There are, and it's hard to keep track because we literally had that Tuesday split screen courtroom situation, but there are actually two criminal conspiracies that were involved in putting Donald Trump in the White House that right now don't have much to do with each other. You have Michael Cohen and the hush money to the mistresses. You have Paul Manafort, who is at the crux of the collusion conversation. And right now, Trump and his team seem really adamant about moving the goalposts to say that this hush money to mistresses doesn't matter. Of course it does. It violates U.S. law. But there's no collusion, and we don't have that. And they seem pretty sure that they can be out on a limb with that. And I think that's probably because they seem pretty confident that Paul Manafort will keep his mouth shut, perhaps because of a possible pardon hanging out there for him.
Yeah, to quote the president, he says a crime is not a crime, or he's at least suggesting that what Michael Cohen did is not a crime. John, let me ask you really quickly, can Donald Trump really distance himself here from Michael Cohen?
Well, I don't know. If you know somebody for 10 years, it gets a little hard. And, you know, he was described as a fixer by no less than Rudy Giuliani, who said, that's what we do at law firms. And then he lost his job the next day, which tells us that maybe law firms have a better ethical standard than Rudy and the Beast, if you will. I don't see how he gets away from it. And if you just even listen to the one tape recording we had, it sort of puts the lie to this whole mess about the girlfriends, and that is that he he's in a conversation, and it's all about the campaign. One is about talking to reverends in the South somewhere. Another is about whether Ivana's divorce, and those details will come out before the election is over. And then the third one is, how do we pay off AMI? How do we do that? And he says cash. That is, Trump says cash. And it's Cohen comes back and says, no, 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 we'll do it by checks. And we now know that that turned out not to be a good idea for a couple of reasons, including it would identify the fact that there was no journalistic behavior on the part of AMI and the National Enquirer. So they stopped that. But we have the other example in which plainly cash is being channeled around, and it's not from a campaign, and it's from Trump, and Trump is being contradicted by Cohen and details and facts and all sorts of things. But that's what he does.
Let me share with you guys some news that we were getting here. And you talked about AMI and the David Pecker situation. Obviously, he's agreed, or at least received an agreement of sorts to in the Michael Cohen connection about the payments. But we got this wire from the AP a short while ago. The National Enquirer's safe held damaging Trump stories. And in it, Jeff Horowitz writes, the National Enquirer kept a safe containing documents on hush money payments and other damaging stories it killed as part of its cozy relationship with Donald Trump leading up to 2016 presidential elections. People familiar with the arrangement have told the Associated Press. We have that up there on the screen. So another interesting layer and development here. Betsy, let me ask you really quickly about Cohen's plea, because Trump said today that Cohen's plea was really about other business. It wasn't about crime. Take a listen.
He was in another business, totally unrelated to me, where I guess there was fraud involved and loans and taxi cabs and all sorts of things, nothing to do with me, because he had an outside business. He worked for me. You could really say it was more or less part-time. He had other businesses. He had other clients. I'm not his only client.
Betsy, what do you make of that? The president there trying to distance Michael Cohen, trying to belittle him in stature, not in his role, not in stature. So how do you see that playing out as a defense strategy? Is that going to work?
To be fair, there is a grain of truth in what the president is saying here. Some of the charges to which Mr. Cohen pleaded guilty aren't directly related to the work that he did on behalf of the president or on behalf of then-candidate Donald Trump. But, of course, the most interesting part of that plea deal are the two campaign finance violations to which Michael Cohen did plead guilty, and the fact that Cohen himself said under oath that the president of the United States directed him to engage in illegal activity to help the president's campaign. All the throat clearing in the world, all the shiny object waving in the world is not going to change the fact that the president's former lawyer said that under oath. And the fact that he said it under oath is really important. Any journalist who covered the 2016 presidential campaign, myself included, can tell you that Cohen had a reputation for saying things that were not true, that he lied like a dog. It was kind of his thing, as did many people in Trump's orbit. But the fact that he said this under oath is really significant and points to potential legal jeopardy here.
John, let me come back to you just really quickly about this National Enquirer, that they've had this safe that has these documents, potentially damaging documents. Just to get it accurate, I want to make sure it has the documents on the hush money payments and other damaging stories it killed as part of its relationship, cozy relationship, I should say, with Donald Trump. Are those documents now subject to federal review, given the fact that you have David Pecker cooperating with authorities?
Well, I don't know if he's cooperating. He has immunity. At least that's the story I read, meaning he's being compelled to testify and quote, to cooperate under penalty of contempt, and if he lies, perjury. But that's what I understand his circumstances. So he's probably a reluctant cooperator. So yes, all the documents will come to the government, and what they'll identify or not is that there was a lot of goings on that had nothing to do with journalistic enterprise, and that these organs of AMI, particularly National Enquirer, were being used as part of the election, and they weren't being declared in any filing. But on top of it, what we have is, I think, a typical conspiracy to defraud the United States by undermining the election process. So there's a whole series of things that are opening up. And the fact that they want to give immunity to Pecker means that they're interested in getting others. Now, who? Well, we're going to have the president perhaps as an unindicted co-conspirator. I hope somebody has the gumption to name him in an indictment, because there's been nothing like this in the history of America. A president so un-American, who's not a Republican, who's compromising the United States and using these pardons that he suggests, that's a violation of his oath of due process. That is to say, he's using his oath to protect himself from an investigation and those he would keep quiet, just as in Nixon. And if you can give Nixon credit, as Elizabeth might, he was not as bad as this guy, if that's possible to conceive of.
Let me ask you really quickly, Jess, when you think about with the fact that Michael Cohen recorded his conversations with the president, that you had somebody like Omarosa recording some of her conversations at the White House, you have now the National Enquirer holding on to these documents, these stories that, you know, were supposedly killed, the trace of the hush money payments. It seems that anybody who was in President Trump's orbit, at least in some case, was trying to keep record of some of this negativity and some of this fallout, just in the event that they would be in the position that they are in today.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I've been really drawn to this part of the story. The number of people who were very close to him, who had known him for a decade plus, who were apparently either trying to cover their own actions by having a tape of him doing wrongdoing, or waiting to set him up years down the road. The man ran his business like a small-time crime boss, and he brought people around him, the thugs who threatened people when they tried to take his ties out of Macy's, all the way up to his fixer lawyer, Michael Cohen. He surrounded himself with these people who played these small-time crime syndicate roles, and I guess they played them well enough that they knew to record the boss telling them to break the law, because one day they might have to play that in court. And today is that day, I guess.
Yeah, it seems like trust was very low among all of those parties. Congresswoman, before we go, I'd like to ask your thoughts on the fact that Jeff Sessions today responded to the president. You know, he's been the subject of many attacks, but to see the Attorney General defend his own position and what he's been doing at the Department of Justice, what do you make of that? Rare.
Well, it is rare. It's a surprise because Jeff Sessions has been pretty quiet about all this stuff. But I just want to go back to the point I made before about pardons that John Flannery mentioned. It's not an issue of due process. It's called an abuse of power, and that is an impeachable offense. Abuse of power, to use your power, a pardon, to shut people up because they could tell the truth about you when you've violated the law. Trying to get rid of Sessions because he recused himself, which he had to do under ethics rules of the Justice Department, because what Trump wants is to shut down the Russia investigation. That's an abuse of power. What we are seeing here is the President of the United States systematically, time after time, this circumstance, that circumstance, abusing the power of his office. The swamp wasn't in Washington. The swamp was in Trump Tower. And it's now in the Oval Office.
Yeah, I wonder if he's being advised against firing people like Rod Rosenstein and Jeff Sessions in the same way that we heard Giuliani advising him against pardoning Paul Manafort. It'll be interesting.
The growing chasm between the president and the wayward DOJ comes as more on the radical left are calling for the president's impeachment, an idea the president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, says would not sit well with the American people.
I think impeachment would be totally horrible. I mean, there's no reason. He didn't collude with the Russians. He didn't obstruct justice. Everything Cohen says has been disproved. You'd only impeach him for political reasons, and the American people would revolt against that.
Joining me now is former NYPD officer and former Secret Service agent Dan Bongino. Welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on tonight. Let me ask you about that first one. What do you think about what Rudy Giuliani just said there?
Giuliani's right. I mean, impeachment for what? For winning an election? You're supposed to be impeached, according to the Constitution, for high crimes and misdemeanors, not no crimes and no misdemeanors. The only crime Donald Trump committed was winning an election. I'm using crime in air quotes, obviously. I mean, this is absurd. What did he do wrong? There has been no evidence of collusion, the big conspiracy theory on the left and by some figures in the media. No evidence of that at all. All we've gotten are taxi cab confessions and other nonsense stuff that really speaks to things we already knew about Donald Trump. He wasn't dishonest about who he was before he became president. This is an outrageous line that's going to backfire against the Dems if they continue with it. And one more thing. Moderate Democrats know this. This is not a mystery. Some Democrats know this is a loser for them, the impeachment line.
Well, I mean, if you listen to Michael Cohen or his lawyer, Lanny Davis, of course, you have the Clinton cleaner here defending the Trump cleaner. It all makes me kind of want to take a shower. But beyond that, you know, he says that he pled to a federal crime and he implicated the president in that same federal crime. It's straightforward. And that's conspiracy.
Yeah, well, someone should tell the former FEC commissioner who actually knows about this stuff, who wrote an op-ed saying the exact opposite. He may know a little bit more about these things than Lanny Davis. He was actually the head of the Federal Elections Commission, and he said there's no way this is a crime. Matter of fact, it's barely a civil violation. Here's how you have to evaluate. I ran for office. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty familiar with how these laws work. If an expense would have existed with or without the campaign, then it's not necessarily a campaign expense. Donald Trump, we can't get in his head. We don't know why he paid that money. Maybe it was because he didn't want his family to hear about it. He wanted some reputation management. I'm not saying it was a good thing. I'm not saying these aren't untoward. I'm not saying Trump wouldn't want to take it back. I'm just saying to claim that's a campaign expense and then to outrageously claim, like Davis did, that this is straightforward slam dunk stuff is nonsense. Davis is reaching here at big time.
What do you think about the publisher of the National Enquirer now getting involved? We're hearing that he's been granted immunity in order to cooperate in some part of this case. What is the implication of that?
Melissa, listen, I've been saying this forever. They're not investigating collusion here. They're investigating Donald Trump. There's a difference. And having been a former law enforcement officer, this stuff frightens me, and it should frighten everybody else watching today, too. If you walked into the Secret Service office where I worked and said, hey, I want my neighbor investigated. For what? I don't know. You'll find something. You know what? You probably would. But you don't do that in a constitutional republic. The National Enquirer, Mr. Pecker there, and him all of a sudden being given immunity to testify against Donald Trump, you have to ask yourself, when is this going to end? Who's next? Who gets immunity next? They're looking for Trump. They're not looking for a crime.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard some people say that what David Pecker might have done over at the National Enquirer is fraud because he bought a story with the idea of burying it. But in my mind, you don't go to the National Enquirer because you want your story to get out there and you want your voice to be heard. If that's what you want to do, you go to the New York Times or you go to the Wall Street Journal, or you go to the Washington Post. If you're going to the National Enquirer, you're looking for money in exchange for your story, plain and simple, which, as I understand it, is exactly what these women got.
Right. Melissa, this isn't National Review. I mean, it's the National Enquirer. I mean, are we seriously shutting down the country for about a year and a half now? I mean, not exactly. We're not shutting down the country, but this is unquestionably taken a deep toll on the country's collective psyche, this collusion investigation, which was supposedly what's this about. Is this what we're up to now? Michael Cohen's taxi medallions, National Enquirer stories about Stormy Daniels. I mean, this is what... we have to ask ourselves at some point, is this really worth it? This is what blew up, candidly, in the Republicans' face during the Clinton years. They'd had enough. Well, they were like, okay,
I don't know if the Democrats have learned that lesson. I don't know if other networks have learned that lesson. If you look at CNN and MSNBC, they use the word impeach or impeachment 222 times around this story. It's really driving it home. My thought is, I wonder if this doesn't blow up in the Democrats' face in the sense that it reignites voter enthusiasm. If they go out and vote in the midterms thinking my president's going to be taken away, that this person that we elected, that Democrats are going to try and impeach him and I better go out there and vote for Republicans, it could end up having the opposite impact of what they're looking for there. Your thoughts on that?
Melissa, I'm reasonably confident that some moderate and reasonable Democrats, there are some left, believe it or not, it pains me to say it, but it's true. I'm not going to do what they do to us. They have to know this is a complete loser. What really gets me is the first part of what you said there. That media networks whose business are this, eyeballs, right? Eyeballs, they have to, it's a business. It's journalism, but it's still a business. You have to pay the bills. CNN is losing to cat videos on YouTube. Their ratings are down by double digits. You would think somebody in a boardroom making editorial decisions would be like, hey, guys, listen, is there really any evidence on this collusion thing? Because we're losing to remakes of beachfront property on HGTV at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday.
Those sound like good shows, Dan. I don't know. You're tempting me there. I love cat video. I love beach shots. You're tempting me here, but no, it is Trump derangement. I mean, some people have gotten so insane with the idea of impeachment that they're just really frothing at the bit. But anyway, Dan Bongino, thank you for your time, my friend.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. Mid-fall elections are coming up, and a lot is at stake, and not just on the policy questions. If Democrats win, and at this point that could definitely happen, maybe it's even likely to happen, they will immediately try to impeach the president. Now, they claim they're not planning to do that, but that's untrue. They've wanted to impeach Trump since the day he took office. The first crime they alleged, you'll remember, was collusion with Russia. Then they claimed obstruction of justice for firing Jim Comey, because firing people in the federal government is by definition obstruction. After that, they fantasized about impeaching the president for the supposed crime of pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords. Then it was the immigrant family separation. And then it was the Helsinki press conference with Vladimir Putin, which they told us was treason. Now there's the news this week that Trump paid off an ex-girlfriend in an extortion scheme. They're claiming that's impeachable, too. No doubt there will be other high crimes they tell us about in the near future. The pretext doesn't really matter, actually. Democrats want to remove Trump from office because they hate him. That's the reason. If they get their congressional majority back, they will start that process on day one. They will have to do that because their base demands that they do that. Look at the polls. That tells you the whole story. Republicans, of course, are horrified by all of this, but they shouldn't be horrified by it. Unlike a special counsel investigation or sabotage by career federal bureaucrats, impeachment is legitimate. It is a constitutional process. If you think a president has committed high crimes, you impeach him. That's what the document tells us to do. You put him on trial in Congress, you present your evidence, you let the Senate decide guilt or innocence. There's nothing secretive about it or stealthy. It all takes place in public. It is a totally transparent process. Voters get to decide what they think, and then they render their judgment at the ballot box. Last time Congress impeached a president, voters did not like it at all. They punished the party that did it, the Republicans, in the midterm elections of 1998. That was 20 years ago, but Democrats, who have a long memory, remember it well. And that's why they're lying about their intent to impeach Trump right now. Democratic lawmakers act like the thought of impeachment has barely crossed their minds. Impeachment? Really? What? It's the same tactic they use with immigration and so many other issues. Hide their real goals and hope the country doesn't notice. Well, we have noticed. So let's have an honest debate about it. Joining us now is Christy Setzer. She's president of New Heights Communications. Christy, thanks for coming on.
Glad to be here.
So you will concede, I hope, that there's really no, and by the way, this is not an attack, as I just noted, merely an observation. There's really no question that Democrats will have to initiate impeachment proceedings against Trump if they retake the House.
I'm not sure about that. What I do think is that Democrats want some measure of accountability. I think that we've been extremely frustrated, not to put too fine a point on it, by the last 20 months in which no matter what Trump has done, whether it has been a series of things that most Americans find immoral or un-American, or even at this point actively criminal behavior, Republicans have sat on their hands and done nothing about it. We've seen hearing after hearing on Hillary's emails, but none on, let's say, to get to the bottom of the Trump Tower meeting.
Well, there has been quite a, I think we've covered it maybe every night for the last year and a half, this Russia investigation, two of them actually, one initiated by Congress, the other by the special counsel. But I just don't understand why everyone's so embarrassed of impeachment. That is the constitutional remedy. It's a political process. It's designed to be a political process. The rest of us can participate in it by voting. Why are we lying? Why are Democrats lying about impeachment? Oh, well, we're not really sure. Of course you're going to impeach him. You should impeach him. If you think he committed crimes, impeach him. Why is that a scary thing to say?
Because it's one of many options, right? Right now, we're looking at several different ways, I believe, that the president could be held accountable. The biggest one and the most salient one, I think, for most Democrats are the November elections, in which, yes, there will be measures to hold the president accountable if Democrats take back the House and, hell, maybe even the Senate. But the other way is judicial accountability. We are now talking about a president who has potentially committed crimes. He was the unindicted co-conspirator in Michael Cohen's case.
But before I ask you about that crime, let me just ask for the third time this question. Why not just say the most accountable form of accountability is impeachment, because it's transparent, unlike the legal proceedings we're watching, certainly unlike the creepy special counsel investigation. There's nothing hidden about impeachment. You present your evidence in public in an open court. Why are Democratic leaders lying about that? Well, we're not really sure. If you think he committed crimes, why wouldn't you impeach him? What is the answer, honestly?
I think the answer, honestly, is that some people have called for that, but the political reality is that you take 67 votes in the Senate.
Oh, the public doesn't like it. Oh, I get it, because if there was broad public support for it, then you would do it. But if he's such an obvious criminal, why isn't there public support for it?
Well, the real question is, why isn't there Republican support for it, right? That is the political reality.
Because their voters don't want it. That's why.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty simple. It's a political process.
But why wouldn't they want it, given that, again, the president has committed a crime,
they disagree
more
with
than
you.
one federal crime?
Because they disagree with you. And disagreement is still allowed, despite the left's attempts to criminalize it. We're allowed to disagree still for this brief moment. So, again, my question is, if it's so obvious the president has committed all these crimes, why doesn't the majority of America want him impeached? I'm confused.
I'm not sure that they don't, to be honest. But again,
Well, no
I think that
that
the more immediate goal for Democrats should be political accountability and judicial
Well, you
accountability.
have political accountability. It's called impeachment, but you don't want to do it because despite all the carping about how he's a criminal, you still haven't convinced the public of that. And I wonder if that gives you pause. You spend 2 years telling everyone that he's a racist and a felon, but they still don't believe it. Maybe they don't believe you.
I think that the views on actually are changing. If you look at the Democratic base, for example, they actually do want that, and the majority of independents do as well. But at the same time, again, I don't think that that should be the only option.
No, but it's the legitimate one. It's rather than use entrenched career federal bureaucrats to undermine the president in really the least legitimate possible way. Why not just man up and do it in an honorable constitutional way? That's my plea to you. Please do it. But let's get to the crime. So you will concede that he was extorted by Stormy Daniels. He paid her over $100 grand because he didn't want her to talk. That's extortion. I think we all would.
No, that is paying off a porn star to keep silent about something that he.
Why is that not extortion? If I say I'm going to tell the public about something bad you did unless you pay me money, that's called extortion.
This is actually a pattern of behavior that Donald Trump has, not just with Stormy Daniels, but with other women he's slept with, and also people in the White House.
But I'm not denying that.
No, I'm just saying.
And I don't think he should have paid them, and I think it's immoral. That's my view.
Yeah.
But paying someone to keep quiet, if I demand that you give me money in order to be quiet, I'm extorting you, I'm blackmailing you, which is itself a crime. Why would you support that?
What I don't support is the fact that in Donald Trump's White House, and I believe this is unprecedented, he has asked for not just NDAs from everybody who works there or was on the campaign, but also non-disparagement agreements, which means that nobody who
But hold on, you're not answering my question.
No, I am. I'm saying this is the way he operates.
Okay,
this is the way he operates.
But he paid her, or else she was going to besmirch his reputation. That's extortion. Okay. But where's the crime? I'm totally missing that. I mean, I think you could argue it's immoral to cheat on your wife. You guys don't believe in marriage, so you're not going to argue that. But instead you're arguing it's a campaign.
I sit here as a married woman, but yes.
But I mean, obviously that's the real argument, but instead it's a campaign finance violation? It's not.
It is a campaign finance violation. If you are using money from the campaign to pay off this woman.
Yes, that's a crime right there. But that's not what he's accused of doing. He's not accused of using campaign donations to pay her off, is he? Because that would be a crime.
I believe he is, and that's why he said, no, I used campaign
because that's
money
a
as
flat out, I
personal
mean,
money.
look, if I'm wrong, I will definitely stand corrected.
Yeah.
And I will not defend that, by the way, because that would be a flat-out crime and people go to jail for that. My impression is it's his money. That's nothing to do with the campaign.
I think that is what he said, although the story, as you know, has changed quite a bit from I didn't know anything about it to I learned about it later.
My producers who are on this say there's no evidence that he used campaign funds. Again, that would be a crime, and I would be the first to say he should be prosecuted for that.
Okay.
But no one's listening. So why is it a crime to accede to an extortion demand? I'm totally, honestly confused.
The reason why people have been very exercised about this is because this happened at a really suspicious time, right? It happened October before the election, so a couple weeks, let's say, right after the Access Hollywood tape had come out, and it truly, truly damaged his candidacy to the point of people wondering if he was actually going to have to drop out or something.
Well, he won anyway, right?
So it was going to be coming out potentially at the same time. He wanted to make sure it didn't.
Okay, so
that is what it is.
So you're saying that if people had
election.
found out that Donald Trump might have committed adultery, something he bragged about on Howard Stern multiple times, that they wouldn't have voted for him, even after they saw the Access Hollywood tape where he bragged about his low sexual standards. So, like, actually what you're saying doesn't make any sense at all.
That's actually the case, though, is that his ratings, his approval ratings dropped significantly. His polling dropped significantly after the Access Hollywood tape came out.
So when Bill Clinton paid off during the 1996 campaign Monica Lewinsky with a job, when he sent her over to Bill Richardson for a job, paid her off for her silence, that wasn't a campaign finance violation. But this president paying off his girlfriend is...
Bill Clinton was extensively investigated.
He definitely was. He was definitely impeached. He shouldn't have been. I agree. But he wasn't charged with a campaign finance violation. Why is that?
I think that they're apples and oranges.
Okay. They're apples and oranges. Well, I'm calling apples on that. Christy, I hope you impeach him so we can just have an honest conversation about it.
Thank you, Tucker.
Thank you.
Right now, where the president's talking about going after those who try to steal our intellectual property, namely the Chinese, but it's not limited to the Chinese. This comes after his interview with Ainsley Earhardt, in which the president said that all this looking at him and eventually Democrats take control of the House and try to impeach him, they'll rue the day. This is an important development here because the president framed this in a way I've never heard before. If Democrats were to succeed in going after him and trying to impeach him. Listen to this.
If the Democrats take back power, do you believe they will try to impeach you?
Well, you know, I guess it says something like high crimes and all. I don't know how you can impeach somebody who's done a great job. I'll tell you what, if I ever got impeached, I think the market would crash. I think everybody would be very poor because without this thinking, you would see numbers that you wouldn't believe.
All right, the market would crash if they try to lay a glove on me. We've got Liz Peek back with us, the Fox contributor, GOP fundraiser extraordinaire, Noel Nickbohr, reporter extraordinaire, one of the world's best, Charlie Gasparino. Charlie, what do you make of that? Chase him, you chase this market goodbye.
He's right. The markets are going to crash. I mean, you can see it every time there's a negative. I mean, look at what happened with Michael Cohen when the news broke that he was going to cooperate or semi-cooperate and plead guilty. Futures traded off pretty dramatically. Now they came back, but you know, the market, if you look at it since December 22nd, when we passed the tax cut, has basically flatlined. I think there are two reasons for that. I think it's trade, which is at the top of the thing. People are deathly afraid of a trade war, or investors are. But number two, it's the overhang of uncertainty about this Mueller stuff.
And the uncertainty can be more of a drag, right, Noel? But I mean, how is that being played out on things when, you know, Republicans are trying to get elected and try to control the House? I mean, how much of a factor is all this stuff?
You know, it depends on where you are. It's kind of like a sideshow going on. You've got this Trump sideshow going on with Mueller and the investigation and Cohen and Manafort, and then you have the elections. And if you look at it, we've got, you know, a lot of gubernatorial races on the ballot. We have Senate, congressional. And basically they're federal, but a lot of these are local races. So you stick to the message of the economy and what's going on in your state as a whole.
Right.
This is mainly a distraction, and it's also an opportunity that the Democrats are using to take pop shots at candidates running for office to tie them to Trump.
But you don't think it leads a little bit into that?
No, I really don't, because what we're seeing is people really like this economy. People like the economy. People like having jobs. People feel a sense of security.
No, but it bolsters the Democratic enthusiasm in an off year. I'm not saying there's going to be a blue wave, but it has to help.
Well, but number one, our fundraising
really could
is still
backfire and bolster Trump turnout. Nothing will fire up Trump supporters like the idea that someone is going to take away this duly elected election president, and because of this issue that
our fundraising is still up. So look at that. The donors are still writing checks to the RNC.
I'm not saying I buy into the blue wave, but if you look at the one voter class that will get turned off by Trump and his rhetoric and some of this, you know, malfeasance around him. Obviously, it's not touched him directly. It's white suburban women, and you know, he's not polling well with them.
What about the working class men and women that voted him in? But these guys are the ones that turned those states from blue to red.
Right,
those voters
what
still
those,
with him.
No, what also turned those states from blue to red was black voter turnout did not turn out. And they did not turn out because they weren't enthused.
Well, tell me what they're enthused about to be on the Democratic side. This impeachment stuff? Not really. It's not been motivating in other races.
Donald Trump came out last night or today and talked about white farmers in South Africa. I'm telling you.
Well, let me switch gears a little bit to get back to this argument here, and you can help me with this, Liz. This notion the president has that, you know, go ahead, you want to risk this bull market and everything else, you know, make my day. Now, that was much the same argument that I think saved Bill Clinton. We had an economic boom going on, the bull market, the internet stocks was going on. I'm not saying that, you know, had there been more substantive case and senators could weigh that case and the impropriety of an affair with an intern lying about it, wouldn't have been a big deal for them regardless. But less of a big deal in the middle of a boom to try to heave the president out. Less of a big deal now in the middle of a boom to try to heave this president out.
I think that's absolutely true. Anyone running for office should be out there saying, why are you going to change horses in midstream? Are you happy where you are now? The country is happier in terms of the direction of the country polling than it's been since 2005. There's no question people are comfortable. You know, spending on restaurants was up 10% in the last month. They're spending on discretionary items. That's an incredibly good sign, and it's the direct translation of consumer optimism, business optimism.
And by the way,
high
that could explain why
unemployment, et
some of the
cetera.
Democrats in running don't talk up impeachment, and why a lot of the party leadership low-keys it, because it could boomerang, right?
And I think they know that, again, the midterm elections are all about turnout. There's nothing more forceful to generate enthusiasm amongst Trump supporters than the idea that they're going to try and impeach him.
Nothing more. There's nothing that will drive the enthusiasm from the core Democratic voters who stayed home, and those are mainly African Americans, is some of Donald Trump's rhetoric.
I know the polling on African Americans is actually moving in the president's favor
because of black,
people are getting
black
hired,
employment.
felons are getting hired, et cetera.
I know that, but
I think that's old news.
I don't
It's
think
old
so.
news. That's not fake news. It's old news.
The Democratic Party is moving more towards the left. These progressive candidates are getting more and more publicity where the party's going.
If you have 4% economic growth and you have his poll numbers, that's not good.
But I don't know. I think this president doesn't say things by accident. A lot of times they're impulsive and all. But I think there was a method to his mentioning that and say, all right, go ahead.
Well, he's threatening that if we don't have Donald Trump and his thinking that the market's going to crash and we're going to be poor. This will evoke fear into some people about, oh my gosh, we better make sure that we have the House and the Senate. We're going to get out there and support it because we don't want to go down. Look what he did for us.
Of all the crazy things he says, I think that was kind of accurate. I mean, if you play it out.
Well, markets certainly
but
that.
Think about it.
Democrat or Republican, because that's a huge deal.
If the political winds turn to the point that Democrats control Congress and maybe the Senate, and then you have a really impaired president, that is not good for the economy. I mean, given how left these guys are.
I think we're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Absolutely.
There are still some pretty serious questions about whether these payments actually were illegal, whether the president is actually going to get dinged by that. If he were to pardon Paul Manafort, that goes away as an issue overnight.
Manafort is not his problem.
Well, I'm saying, yes, it might be. The second trial is theoretically...
I don't understand the big deal over these payments. You're right.
It's a little confusing,
At first, I thought if they came from campaign cash, that would be a big deal.
Well, does it matter, really?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Yes, totally. You are allowed to give unlimited money to your own campaign.
Impeachment is political.
And it's also...
Impeachment is political.
They can seize on that. You're right.
Impeachment is political.
But then,
if the Democrats control Congress, they can impeach him. It's political. It's a political.
They can seize on a document and take it to the next level.
The president has a warning for lawmakers. Listen.
You know, I guess it says something like high crimes and all. I don't know how you can impeach somebody who's done a great job. I'll tell you what, if I ever got impeached, I think the market would crash. I think everybody would be very poor, because without this thinking, you would see numbers that you wouldn't believe in reverse.
This is where we are right now. The president of the United States arguing against his own impeachment, David.
Yeah, I've heard lots of arguments against impeachment, actually, on both sides of the aisle. I've never heard one that said the president, any president, shouldn't be impeached because the country, everybody will be poor. That seems to be a bit grasping at straws there to me. But what I do think you hear the president formulating there is a political argument against impeachment. His former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is out there urging every Republican to run on this issue, on the threat of impeachment. And it's actually also why, Anna, you see some Democrats concerned about bringing up impeachment on the campaign trail as an issue and a message, because it could backfire on them. It really could rally the Republican base to come alive in an election season where they've been a little apathetic, and we've seen in the primary season in terms of turnout. If the idea that the entire Trump presidency is on the line, that could awaken some Republicans, which Democrats fear.
President Trump is arguing against his own impeachment, not a thing you want to be arguing against. He's been implicated in a crime by his former lawyer, and now the president is warning in an interview that if he is impeached, could have consequences.
I don't know how you can impeach somebody who's done a great job. I'll tell you what, if I ever got impeached, I think the market would crash. I think everybody would be very poor, because without this thinking, you would see numbers that you wouldn't believe.
We recall the market crash when he was elected as well. All of this comes after Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to campaign finance violations, saying he made hush money payments to women at the direction, this is important, of the president. Today, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that American Media CEO David Pecker, that's the company who publishes the National Enquirer, was granted immunity in the Cohen case. He reportedly met with prosecutors to describe the involvement of Cohen and Trump in the hush money deal during the 2016 election. Cohen previously released a recording of him discussing a payment with Mr. Trump, but the president is contradicting that, insisting he didn't know about it at the time.
Did you know about the payments?
Later on, I knew. Later on. But you have to understand, Ainsley, what he did, and they weren't taken out of campaign finance. That's a big thing. That's a much bigger thing. Did they come out of the campaign? They didn't come out of the campaign. They came from me.
In April, the president also said he didn't know where the money came from, but despite his changing narrative and to cover all of his bases, he also insists it wasn't a crime.
Almost everybody that runs for office has campaign violations. But what Michael Cohen pled to weren't even campaign related. They weren't crimes.
Joining me now is Jordan Fabian. He's a White House correspondent for The Hill. Jordan, what is a crime, and does the president get to define it or not? Are these minor campaign finance violations, or are they criminal acts?
Well, I can tell you, Tony, that what Michael Cohen pled to yesterday in federal court were felonies, including the campaign finance violations, 2 counts of which he pleaded guilty to. And so this is really raising a lot of questions for the president as to how much he was involved with this scheme. Michael Cohen, somebody whose credibility has obviously been in question before, says he was quite involved. The president says he wasn't, but I'm sure that investigators, both in the New York prosecutor's office and lawmakers on Capitol Hill, are rushing to get to the bottom of it.
In a narrow election, Trump won in 2016. The information that he had perhaps 2 affairs with 2 women and then paid them not to talk, that seems like material to the outcome. Couldn't it be argued that he's defrauding the American people here? And does it make a difference, as the president is now arguing, that he paid the money personally, it didn't come from the campaign?
Right. So this gets into a lot of nitty-gritty details, but I've spoken to legal experts about this, and they say it can be legally problematic for a couple of reasons for the president. One is that this would be considered what is called an in-kind contribution. So even though it's not campaign money, the fact that, as you say, this may have helped the president win in 2016 can be seen as a contribution. Whether or not the money came from the campaign, the amount listed by prosecutors was $280,000. That would exceed legal limits from any one individual to a campaign. And not to mention that this money was not put on the campaign finance report that the president's campaign put out at the end of 2016. It was only added later when all of this was revealed. So those are some of the legal issues here for the president and for Michael Cohen.
The Democrats, on the whole, are avoiding the word impeachment, the I word, but the president is talking about it and trying to draw a line between his potential impeachment and damage to the economy. What's the strategy there?
Well, you have to remember that impeachment is more of a political question than it is a legal question. And right now, Republicans believe that the impeachment issue is advantageous to them. They think that Democrats are getting over their skis if they talk about impeaching President Trump. That's why you saw him on Fox and Friends talking up the economy, talking up his record, really saying, look, I'm in a good political position now. You don't want to impeach me. Of course, that could all change if Democrats take back control of one or both chambers of Congress this fall. They're trying to be quiet about the impeachment question right now, at least at the leadership level. That could change if they're in control and are able to bring impeachment proceedings against the president.
President Trump has been railing against special counsel Robert Mueller by name on Twitter. That's a change from recent history. And yet, in a new poll, Robert Mueller is at 59% approval rating. That is up 11 points, I believe, since July. And this very same poll found that 40% of people expect that Mueller's investigation will find that the president committed criminal or impeachable offenses. That is also up about 5 points. Does the White House think it's winning this battle in the court of public opinion over the investigation, or is it concerned at this point?
Well, I think there's concern about the legal developments this week, certainly, but I think that's only going to ramp up this public campaign against Robert Mueller that the president and his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, have been carrying out over the past few months. The president has, for now, decided that he's not going to fire Robert Mueller. He hasn't done that yet, but the strategy he's pursuing is to basically destroy his credibility in the court of public opinion. The poll that you just showed shows that that is not working. Of course, these indictments this week, or excuse me, these convictions are really bolstered Mueller's credibility in the eyes of the public. You know, this is a real conviction against Paul Manafort, of course, guilty of 18 felonies, and Michael Cohen pleading guilty to these crimes. So that's going to naturally lead some people to believe that this investigation is not a witch hunt and has legitimate targets.
And of course, we have to talk about the donors. People who know this sort of thing tell CBS News that Republican Party donors are divided over the president's legal issues, what they mean, what to do about them. I imagine that is bad news for fundraising heading into the midterms.
That's right. The Republicans, the energy doesn't seem to be on their side right now. You know, Democrats out raising them. We're seeing high turnouts in these special elections for Democratic candidates. The energy does appear to be on their side. But that being said, the math, especially on the Senate side, where Democrats are defending so many seats, do give Republicans some sort of advantage there. So despite all of the churn and the craziness of this week, it's still not a foregone conclusion. It's going to give Democrats control of one or both houses of Congress.
And I do want to, before I let you go, play one last bit of sound from the president, a little bit of an entertaining definition of so-called flipping. Take a listen.
And one of the reasons I respect Paul Manafort so much is he went through that trial. You know, they make up stories. People make up stories. This whole thing about flipping, they call it. I know all about flipping. For 30, 40 years, I've been watching flippers. Everything's wonderful, and then they get 10 years in jail, and they flip on whoever the next highest one is, or as high as you can go. It almost ought to be outlawed. It's not fair.
For 30, 40 years, the president's been watching flippers. I presume he means on television crime dramas, maybe in his personal life, unclear at this point. Flipping is a reference to cooperating witnesses, major tool of law enforcement. What do you think of the president's line of attack?
Well, Tony, this really illustrates the divide between the president and the presidency, right? The president, in a normal circumstance, is really the chief law enforcement officer of this country and isn't going to do things that would undermine investigators at the Department of Justice or otherwise who are trying to pursue crimes, often by getting cooperating witnesses to provide evidence. But then you have the president, who is, of course, trying to defend himself at the moment, and he's willing to take extraordinary steps like undercutting his own federal law enforcement entities to do that.
Jordan Fabian, White House correspondent for The Hill. Jordan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Donald Trump is speaking about impeachment this morning in an interview he's given to the friendly program called Fox and Friends on Fox News. Quite an extraordinary television moment for a sitting president. And part of Trump's pushback at his former fixer, former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen. Cohen, of course, implicating Trump in an illegal campaign scheme to silence two women who say they had extramarital affairs with him. Let's listen to what he's just said.
Well, you know, I guess it says something like high crimes and all. I don't know how you can impeach somebody who's done a great job. I'll tell you what, if I ever got impeached, I think the market would crash. I think everybody would be very poor, because without this thinking, you would see numbers that you wouldn't believe in reverse.
So there you go. Donald Trump assessing if he were to be impeached. We have to talk about this. And fortunately, we have a guest to help us do so. You're looking there at Isaac Stanley Becker, who's a staff reporter for The Washington Post. A very busy newsroom these days. And Isaac's in Washington with me this morning. You heard that clip, and you heard it again as we've played it back, Isaac. Let's look at the strategy here. If I'm impeached, everyone will be poor. The economy will crash. What is he thinking? What is he trying to message with that?
Well, first of all, what the Constitution says about impeachment is that the House can impeach based on treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. I did think it was interesting that the president even broached impeachment and was willing to consider that as a hypothetical. But this is certainly the message that the White House wants to get out there, that the consequences of this would be devastating and that the economy has performed well under this president, and that any sort of interference with that would have damaging economic repercussions. We've seen the president tweet recently about the bull market, and certainly he's emphasizing this favorable economic news.
That's what he thinks would be the economic consequences of impeachment. Let's talk about the political implications of all of this, because of the Cohen plea, many people, including some conservative commentators, have been saying it is time to consider impeachment hearings. He has been essentially named as an unindicted co-conspirator, the term, of course, implicated in crimes in breaking campaign finance laws. So time to perhaps consider impeachment hearings. But lawmakers are reluctant to do so, even Democrats. Why?
I think that's right, that the ground really has not shifted that much in Congress, even though we've seen growing calls from pundits and others for impeachment. And, there are a couple of reasons for that. I think for the Democrats, there's a calculation that they're defending a lot of really competitive, difficult seats this November in the midterm elections, and they don't want to put their more vulnerable members in a position of having to run on impeachment of a president that their own states voted for. And with the Republicans, we're seeing, the same sort of resistance and the same sort of unwillingness to even talk about that topic. We saw some Republicans this week say that they were concerned, or that there were, elements of what happened with the legal outcomes on Tuesday with the plea deal and with the conviction that they didn't like, but really nothing beyond that, nothing speaking about direct action they were willing to take or measures in order to, check the White House and, check this administration.
So it's all about the midterms, and the stakes there so high in just a matter of weeks. Not only are Republican lawmakers not talking about impeachment, they're really talking very little about this week's developments at all, the extraordinary Manafort convictions and the plea from Cohen at the very same time. They won't say much. They certainly won't criticize. What do you think could get them to react on this, if anything?
Right. It's difficult to say. I think that Tuesday was such an interesting day. And one of the things that we saw was, in addition to the legal news, there was news out of Iowa, where a young woman, a college student, had disappeared. And authorities said they discovered that the killer was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico. And I would say that this is really in the news that the White House and that Trump's loyal supporters in Congress and elsewhere want to be talking about. If they can make the midterms and the news about the murder of this woman and about the issue of undocumented immigration, then they see themselves as ahead. If the Democrats can make it about corruption and about other aspects of the legal difficulty that the president is in, then they come out ahead in this respect.
Again, all about November and those midterm results. Let me ask you as well about Paul Manafort. In the interview that we're hearing this morning on Fox and Friends, he talks about Manafort and talks about the whole notion of a pardon for Manafort. We certainly heard him praise him yesterday as a brave man, lots of sympathy for him in the current situation in which he finds himself, convicted. But he didn't answer the question directly of whether he would pardon Manafort. What do you think is the likelihood of that?
That's right. He didn't address that question head on. He certainly had a lot of praise for Manafort and praise for him specifically for not cooperating, for staying strong and facing trial. But he certainly was not willing to make a commitment to pardon. And I think that perhaps that's a calculation about how inflammatory that would be, and possibly giving more ground to his critics here.
So the consequences of that. So interesting. Another week of extraordinary times in Washington, and I thank you for helping us understand them better this morning. Isaac Stanley Becker, who works there for the Washington Post. Thanks.
If the Democrats take back power, do you believe they will try to impeach you?
Well, I guess it says something like high crimes and all. I don't know how you can impeach somebody who's done a great job. I'll tell you what, if I ever got impeached, I think the market would crash. I think everybody would be very poor, because without this thinking, you would see numbers that you wouldn't believe in reverse.
Congressional Democrats are way wary about even a mention of the I word, particularly ahead of the midterms. And yet, you heard the president just use it there. Current circumstances, a presidential cover-up of alleged extramarital affairs, allegations of hush money payments, president being implicated in a crime in open federal court just this week. Let's not forget the ongoing Russia investigation. It's all happening during this consequential run-up to the midterm election. And it harkens back to another, there he is, presidential scandal, 20 years ago. Our national political correspondent, Steve Kornacki, is with us at the big board tonight. Here's why this is important. Steve's new book, and we're thrilled to be able to say this, you can never sell these too early, The Red and the Blue, the 1990s and the Birth of Political Tribalism, is coming out October 2nd. Something tells me there may be another mention of the book as we get closer. But, Steve, I know this is your thing.
Well, thank you for that, Brian. I appreciate that. And yes, the parallels between what we're talking about right now and what happened around the same time in 1998, they are unmissable. What has got all this talk stirred up this week, headlines like this, as you say, Michael Cohen implicating Donald Trump in a crime. The crime would be a conspiracy to break campaign finance law to cover up a politically damaging affair. And the accusation 20 years ago about Bill Clinton was that he committed a crime, the crime of perjury, the crime of suborning perjury, encouraging others to commit perjury to do what? To cover up an extramarital affair that would be politically damaging, that might take down Clinton's presidency. So, of course, that kicked off the impeachment drama with Clinton. Clinton survived. How did he survive? Why did he survive? What does that tell us about Trump's situation now? Well, number one, there was this. When the Lewinsky story, just the accusation of an affair, when that broke, Clinton was already very popular. He was at nearly 60% in the polls. Folks said, well, guess what? Now that this is out of the bag, the numbers are going to crash. They didn't crash. They kept going up. Clinton was forced in the summer of 98 to admit to the affair. His popularity actually got higher. September 98, almost exactly 20 years ago, Ken Starr came out with a report that formally accused the president of a crime, committing perjury. Clinton's numbers went up. They had the midterm election in the fall of 98. The White House party, we tell you every time we're on this doing election previews this year, the White House party always loses seats. They gained seats. That told folks that there was a backlash against the idea of impeaching Clinton. And this is the bottom line story of 1998. At the end of that year, when impeachment was being pushed by Republicans, the question was asked, did the president of the United States commit a crime? The vast majority of Americans said yes. Bill Clinton committed a crime. He committed perjury. Those same Americans were asked, okay, he committed a crime. Should he be impeached? And the vast majority there, 58-37, the margin, said no. So Republicans had the votes to impeach. They needed Democrats to go along to convict. And Democrats looked at those numbers. They looked at that election and they said, nope, no need for us to bolt on this president. And Bill Clinton survived.
Out front now, former advisor to the Trump campaign, Michael Caputo. Michael, good evening. Thank you for being with me.
Hi, Poppy.
Hi, good to have you. You told Politico that Michael Cohen's statement yesterday is, and I quote, probably the worst thing so far in the whole investigative stage of his presidency. Do you believe, Sarah Sanders, that the president is not concerned at all about what Michael Cohen may share with Mueller?
I'm not sure we're talking maybe about 6 of one and a half dozen the other. I believe the president's watching. I believe that nobody knows better than the president what knowledge he shares with Michael Cohen. Mm-hmm. Michael Cohen has implicated the president in a campaign finance law violation, one that appears that the prosecution is going to trot out like they did against Senator John Edwards in 2012, mm-hmm. and it didn't end up well for the prosecution then. I'm not quite sure they'll be able to stretch it to the president, but what I said in Politico is this is as close as anything any investigation has come to implicating the president. Of course, there's absolutely nothing to do with Russian collusion here. Mm-hmm. It's a campaign finance violation that we're about to dig into, I think.
Do you think the president today, Michael, did himself any favors, either with his tweets that were slamming Cohen and calling Manafort brave and praising him because he refused to, quote, break, or his explanation to Fox News saying, look, nothing wrong here, nothing to see here, the payoff was my own money? Did he do himself any favors?
I think the president spends time on Twitter trying to amplify his side of the story, and the media and a lot of people in the Democratic Party on Capitol Hill have been amplifying this whole idea that Michael Cohen is leading the president to his ruin. I don't think it's anything like that at all.
But what I'm asking, Michael, is, I mean, the president spent put a lot of effort and energy into these tweets and into this interview with Fox. In what he said, his own words, did he help himself at all?
I think he helped himself with his base. I think he's trying to hold together the support that he has today and the support that he's gained through his policies. I understand what you're saying. I'm not always in favor of every tweet the president sends. And the closer he gets to tweeting about the Mueller investigation, the more nervous it makes me. But at this point in time, if the president is confident that he shares no criminal information with Michael Cohen, I appreciate the fact that he wants to get it out there.
So Republican Congressman Chris Stewart of Utah said something today that struck me when I heard him speaking with Wolf. Let's listen.
It's a mess. And look, I honestly don't know what to believe at this point.
Is it a problem for the president to have members of his own party, conservatives like Chris Stewart, saying publicly they don't know if they can trust him anymore?
Well, I don't know if that's exactly what the representative said, but I do know
Let me
this.
read you the quote. It's a mess.
Okay.
It's a mess. And look, I honestly don't know what to believe at this point. He was asked about Cohen or Trump.
Right. Understood. I get what you're saying. And I think that it's going to be kind of a he said in this situation. It's going to be Michael Cohen, who pled guilty to lying to investigators, versus Donald Trump, who many in the media believe is not honest with the American people.
No,
it's going to be
the tapes prove it. He has lied. We heard it. Caitlin Collins played it out today. I mean, they both lied.
I understand what you're saying, but this is not Donald Trump versus James Comey, who has, somewhat of a reputation for honesty at the Department of Justice. I don't believe he's an honest man. This is Donald Trump versus Michael Cohen, an entirely different kettle of fish here. And, I'm not quite sure this is something that the White House should be panicking about, but I do know this. This is all they need for impeachment. If the Democrats take over the House during the midterm elections, this, indication coming out of the Southern District of New York, this charge is enough for them to run an impeachment against the president, even in the first quarter.
It is interesting to listen to Democrats in Congress and the Senate and the House today, on with me and on with all of us all day, not saying don't go so quickly towards impeachment. Let's wait for the Mueller probe to play out. Let's wait for it to play out. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who, as you know, is a golf buddy of the president, said today to McClatchy it is, quote, too early to tell if Trump can be impeached. Concerning for you to hear that?
I understand what you're saying. I've been kind of parting ways with some of the Republican consulting class in Washington now for quite some time. I really believe that the vote that the voters make on November 6th is going to boil down to if they vote for a Republican member of the House of Representatives, they're going to vote against impeachment. And if they vote for a Democrat member of the House of Representatives or a challenger, they're voting for impeachment. This is all about impeachment. It always has been.
That's all it's about.
I think it always has been. And in fact, with this one charge that Cohen has made apparently at the president, we know that they have enough now to do it.
Okay.
So it's about impeachment in November.
I got to go. Quick yes or no to this. Is the president closer to impeachment today than he was 48 hours ago?
I believe so. I believe we've got real problems in the House of Representatives. Look at Chris Collins and Duncan Hunter. You see it's getting worse.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you coming on tonight.